Looks great.
All righty. So like Maureen mentioned, this talk is supporting our loved ones with physical differences, navigating stairs, cultivating self-esteem, and managing stigma. So before I jump into the research part of this, I wanted to tell you why this is important to me. So a little about me. This is me and my daughter, Penelope. She's 2. But I was born with a venous malformation on my face, neck, tongue. It goes down onto my chest. And so as a young child, I navigated comments from others, stares, watching my parents navigate how to respond when other people were staring at me or making comments. And as many of you in the room might understand, that kind of desire to want to educate people and the desire to be like, stop looking at me, it's none of your business. And so once I got a PhD in communication and was studying health communication, I realized that I really wanted to focus on these areas of illness and medical uncertainty and social support and how we navigate stigma in our world through communication. So these are the few of the articles that I have published that really relevant to this talk. And so looking at how we manage uncertainty in rare conditions, how we talk with physicians when there's often a lack of experts to navigate uncertainty and make sense of our illnesses or our child's illnesses. And then advice from others, as the reason you're all here today is that relying on families and other people who have been through it is often the most relevant type of support, and it can often be more important sometimes than expert support from physicians who don't necessarily know everything that you or your child are going through. So what do we mean when we talk about illness uncertainty? Illness uncertainty is defined in many ways in a lot of different literature. You'll see it in a couple different forms if you look it up, but this is the one that I focus on. It comes from nursing literature, and it's this inability to make sense of medical, personal, and social illness-related events. So it's not just what are my symptoms and what's my diagnosis. Obviously, we navigate that, but it's things like, how does this shift my family structure? How does this influence my identity as a sibling, a parent, a person? And then things like finances and roles, right? How is my job going to be affected? And then in the social realm of this are navigating things like fitting in and rejection and isolation and navigating all sorts of relationships in our lives. So similarly, to get us all on the stage of stigma, what do we mean when we talk about stigma? So stigma is this negative attitude from one person or a society that is attached to the characteristic of a person. And that characteristic is deemed to be some sort of a deficiency, whether it be mental, physical, or social. And so enacted stigma are those actual acts of stigma, acts of discrimination of someone saying or doing something to you. But we also experience felt stigma, which is internalized feelings of shame or fear of that enacted stigma. So for example, I always share that when I started high school, I would always sit on the right-hand side of the classroom so that most people in the room could see the left side of my face. And that was just a way that I was protecting myself from the potential of stigma. Later in life, realizing that probably nobody in there was going to notice or say anything. But it was my way of, when I woke up in the morning and was doing my hair and getting my backpack ready, I was thinking about how I was going to move through the world to protect myself from that felt stigma. And then courtesy stigma is stigma experienced by a family member of somebody else who may be stigmatized. And so this is siblings, parents, grandparents, anyone else who might be with someone and it's actual or felt stigma. And in this paper that I wanted to focus on today and share with you all, I was really looking at acts of enacted stigma and how we manage those. And so this was a paper that we published a few years ago, and we looked at adults. Oh, I'm sorry, this was the perceived stigma, and then I'll jump into the enacted stigma. So we did a survey. Some of you may have participated in it, so thank you very much. Looking at those who perceive higher levels of stigma reported poor physical and mental health outcomes. And this is correlation, not causation, right? So higher severity might result in higher perceived levels of stigma, but we also know that the stress and the fear that comes with stigma can lead to poor physical and mental health outcomes if that person is avoiding going to the doctor, avoiding engaging in self-care activities like going to the gym or going for walks out of the fear of potentially being stigmatized. And so I was really focusing on the personal and professional interest I had in how our identity and self-worth are shaped by stigma and how our family members might also be participating in that. One thing that's really important to remember is that our identity and our self-worth do not exist in isolation. They are not these objective things that we have. They are things that are shaped in part through our interactions with others and also through our internal monologue. But our communication with the world, observation and interaction really shapes our identity and our self-worth. And so that's, as somebody who focuses on communication, why I wanted to look at the enacted stigma. So in this study, I focused on something that are called memorable messages, and I examined the memorable messages that parents of children with all types of vascular birthmarks had received from others, and then what those implications were for stigma and identity for themselves and their child. Memorable messages. I love this definition because I love this idea of sticky messages. So these are sticky messages that layer and linger and influence an individual's self-concept. These are things that stick with you for a very long time. So, for example, I can remember when I was in 6th grade and I was going to Burger King after a volleyball tournament, and the person who I was paying for my meal with said, "We have a bathroom if you would like to wash the marker off of your face." And it was a seemingly innocent comment that she was saying to a 12-year-old who was in 6th grade. But now at 39, I can still remember what that person looked like, what they were saying, and how I felt in that moment when I was with my classmates and that interaction happened. And so that's what I mean with those messages, that years later, you can remember them and they stick with you. They don't have to be negative, though. They can be positive, negative, and sometimes they might even be neutral. So in this study, I gave a prompt to everyone who came to our website to complete the survey. And so what I want you to do right now is to engage in this prompt together. You'll write this down. You don't have to share. But this is the prompt that I gave everyone. Memorable messages are verbal statements that have been told to you in a way in which you remember for a long period of time or may have stuck with you in some way. Often these statements may have also influenced your life or your behavior in some way. Think about a memorable message that you've received from others, a family member, a friend, a physician or other doctor, strangers, a nurse, about your child's condition or physical differences. When you write down this message, try to write it word for word. These are often messages that you can recall exactly how they were delivered and exactly what the other person said. So I'll give you all a chance to think and write down a message that you received word for word that has stuck with you. All right. So next, I would like you to jot down who communicated this message to you and why you considered this message to be memorable. What about it made it stick with you all this time? Or maybe it happened yesterday. That's okay too. But what is it about it that made this something memorable that you can recall? Right. So here's what we found in our survey. This was an online survey where 73 parents of children with vascular anomalies could come in and report as many messages as they wanted to. So they could do a message, report it, do a message, talk about it. So most of the messages came from strangers. Some from family, a lot from healthcare professionals, some from colleagues and acquaintances, and others from friends. But the largest percentage of that category, right, were coming from strangers or acquaintances that weren't necessarily that the family member or the parent knew. These often happened in public or interpersonal settings, but also occurred during medical visits, in small group settings, or at work. And 72.6% of these were negative. And so this was an interesting finding because in most of the memorable messages literature that is out there, it's focused on advice and positive messages that help shape your foundational development in life. So something that a career counselor told you that helped you get your first job, or something that somebody said to you on your first day of work that turned around the way that you were going to handle that job, or something that your realtor said when you were buying your first house that gave you the courage to be able to do it. And so often in the literature, it was focused on that these were coming from important people and they were foundational shaping behaviors that helped you adapt to a situation. What we're realizing when we shift this into the chronic illness space, and especially a space with rarer conditions, a lot of these messages that are sticky and linger are the negative ones. And so what I wanted to look into is how do we respond to condition? And so we call these intrusive requests or intrusive comments because it makes it difficult to be able to know what to say when you're not 100% sure how to explain what's going on. And that was what we really found in this study. So I know there's a lot of words on here. I'm happy to share this PDF, obviously. But some of the messages that we found were either fell into characterizing stigmatizing messages, which were those negative ones, or validating messages that were positive. And so the stigmatizing messages, someone recalled someone saying, does she have that because of something you ate while you were pregnant? And the parent who shared this comment said, I was too stunned to say anything. I didn't know how to respond. Somebody else just looked at the child and the parent remembered them saying, poor kid. And the parent says, I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say back. So these are moments when you receive a comment during a particularly vulnerable time, often by someone that you expected to be supportive. These are also memorable for parents, often when it was the first negative message they had received. So this particularly vulnerable time right after diagnosis or when the child was really young, these first messages can often stick with us because they are a realization of the potential for stigma. The validating messages were obviously wonderful to read. Someone commented about a stranger coming up to them in the grocery store and saying, I know about hemangiomas. Your daughter is beautiful and has a great mom. And this parent said, I cried profusely and felt a sense of peace and calm. And someone else recalls someone saying, it's part of her. Don't worry about covering it up. It makes her who she is. And this parent also recalled swelling up with emotions because they were proud, happy, and relieved. And so these positive messages are also something that stick with us because they provide a sense of relief during that vulnerable time. They're instrumental in your ability to see that you can cope and care for your child's condition. And they are often a pleasant surprise when you're used to receiving negative messages, and they can create a perspective shift. And I talk about this all the time, that anytime someone comes up to me and says, can I ask you a question? Or they seem like they're going to say something to me, I immediately expect they're going to ask me about my birthmark. And so when I get those questions that are completely unrelated, or it's something that's validating or positive, it honestly is the most wonderful surprise because I'm so used to day to day feeling like I'm on the defensive or I'm ready to respond to somebody. So overall, we found that messages either validate identity and they can help internalize feelings of acceptance and support. They can be innocent inquiries that, even though they're neutral, they don't seem like they're overtly negative. Those can reinforce stigma and foster that fear of being in public situations because somebody might make a comment as innocent as it seems. And then, of course, we saw several negative messages that expressed shame or threatened the self-esteem or further reinforced stigma based on physical differences. And so what do we know about this? We know that neutral or negative messages can force individuals to have to spontaneously share illness-related information. And so if I'm going about my day at the grocery store and somebody asks me about my birthmark, in that moment, I wasn't prepared to say, well, I was born with a venous malformation, but I was misdiagnosed and it's rare and I was born with it and it's not genetic. I don't think so, but right, I wasn't prepared to give my script. I wasn't prepared to say what I wanted to share that day. And so sometimes I don't know if I should joke it off or how I'm going to react in a way that I feel comfortable with. And so those unplanned moments of sharing can be really stressful and emotional. And so something that my family did, and then as I started studying this more, realized that this family communication was so important, is preparing yourself and your child when they're old enough in advance to respond to these messages in a way that minimizes feelings of stigma. And that doesn't necessarily being polite to the other person just to avoid their feelings being hurt, but responding in a way where you're taking care of your own feelings of actual or perceived stigma. And so something that I can't stress I have to stress this so much is talking about this and asking your child how they felt when somebody said something or how they'd like to respond or what they want you to say or not say is really helpful so that you feel more prepared when you're walking into these situations. And this was something that was wonderful to share with my siblings. And even now with my husband, he said to me, how do you like me to react if somebody asks me about your birthmark? And then we could have a conversation. So I knew that his response was something that I felt comfortable with and something that I felt represented me in the way that I desired. So when we feel these moments of actual enacted stigma or perceived stigma, we engage in something called identity management. And these are often behaviors that you do to minimize or conceal differences. So physical covering, passing is things like trying to make it seem as if you don't have a physical difference. So if you have overgrowth or a limp, that you try to walk in a way that doesn't show it. We isolate ourselves. We might avoid social situations. Joking. I told somebody one time that I had a skydiving accident, and that's why I have what looks like a large bruise on my face. I was 17, and that felt like the most appropriate response to that person. We can apologize for our differences and make ourselves smaller by minimizing. But these are strategies that we often feel unprepared to engage in. And then after the interaction can feel a little bit of a sense of regret that we didn't respond in the way that we felt. Because in that moment, where often our blood pressure rises, we start shaking, we might start sweating, there is this physiological reaction that's happening. So if you have that script in your head that you've thought of, you feel more prepared to manage those situations. So this is why this talk focuses on supportive others, but obviously I hope this is helpful for even the teens and adults that are listening. Supportive others can help manage stigma and facilitate identity management by expressing unconditional love, modeling acceptance behaviors. I can't tell you the number of times I hear, well, my parents never treated me differently. They didn't tell me I needed to wear makeup. They weren't changing the clothes I was wearing. They were accepting and didn't need to apologize. You can educate others about the condition or symptom. And so instead of getting defensive, saying really proudly what your child's condition is or what your own condition is. And then again, preparing how to respond to strangers' questions. One caution I like to give is that not all support is helpful. Sometimes receiving social support or being protected can actually reinforce isolation and internal feelings of stigma. And so if we try to protect ourselves or our children from social situations, we might actually be doing further harm when it comes to stigma than teaching them behaviors and modeling acceptance. This happens in all sorts of things. I can imagine that you have had things where people were trying to help you cope with grief or a stressful situation, and they say, oh, it's not that big of a deal, or it was meant to be. These things that kind of dismiss what's happening. Those are things that we try to do to give support, and they're actually not very helpful. And so just being cautious of protecting and loving and giving unconditional love to your children, but also encouraging them to go out and not to be isolated. All right, so these are some tips that I have for everyone. It is okay to feel mad, sad, angry, guilty about these interactions. As you saw, most of the interactions occurred with strangers and were negative. And so we have to anticipate them, but we will not be able to predict them, and they can make you feel frustrated and they can reinforce stigma, and that is just part of it. Follow your loved one's lead in terms of don't make a big deal about it if they're not making a big deal about it. Avoid minimizing or overreacting and asking your loved one how you want to respond. I can picture my mom's face with her smile turning upside down and her eyes frowning. She would look at anyone who she thought was looking at me and give them the stare. And I'd be like, Mom, you were making this worse. you are embarrassing me more than this person who's looking at me because I deal with this every single day. This is something that I do at school. This is something I do when I'm playing basketball. Now this is something I do when I'm just out in the world as an adult. And so I would often tell my mom, like, you are making this worse by having your big feelings about it. But at the same time, I wanted to see that she was upset about people teasing her daughter. And so it was an interesting dynamic to have us have conversations about how we navigate those. So embrace those opportunities to talk about those potential interactions. Thinking about key life transitions, if your child is starting a new team, if they're moving to a new school, these are places where they're going to meet people who don't know them, and you're going to meet parents who don't know your child. And so thinking about how will we enter this new situation? What's kind of our game plan? How do we want to react? Isn't being overprotective. It's giving your brain the script to know how to respond when these things come up. Include other family members in the conversation. Like I said, my siblings would ask and we'd have conversations about what to say. And then acknowledging, like I said, that stress of new people and new environments. And one thing I'll share that is in the literature, and I experienced this so personally, is that receiving stares, responding to comments, constantly engaging in identity management is exhausting. And so acknowledge the kind of that this is on their mind every single day. I mean, when I wake up in the morning, I think, okay, do I want to wear my hair in a ponytail? If I do, that means people will probably ask me about it. It's just something that's on my mind all the time. If I'm going to the gym, there's certain exercises I can't do. And so then I go ask my coach if they can give me modifications. And so it's just sometimes every space I go in, I'm thinking about it, and that can feel exhausting. And so just being aware of that and validating it and acknowledging it is very beneficial. And I touched on this already, but providing unconditional love doesn't mean sheltering your loved ones. Equip them with the skills, the communication skills, the psychological skills to thrive in many environments and many social situations. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions, or I'd love to hear thoughts